Well, hello to who is watching, whatever time you're watching, and welcome to Environmental Coffee House. I am Sandy Shellis, and this is the end of the year special. And I found something I thought was really appropriate. And so it is our job to narrate. It is our job to bring forth. And while I could write very easily, there are those already articulating what is in our psyche, what we are feeling. And tonight I found one for 2020, the end. So it is, I'll show it to you to start. It is sick and tired of virus banalities, public goods from the Bullet. And the Bullet is the socialist project in Canada. Okay, and it's pretty cool. So I am going to read this. I'm going to discuss it with you, but we're going to hear this for the end. This is the end of 2020, and it has been quite a run. Quite a run. So here we go. Everyone has seen those cheesy t-shirts which say, "My grandmother went to Tahiti and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. One of our friends went to Venice and bought us back an attractive mask. One of those with a protruding beak. It hangs on the wall in our hallway. I pass by it many times every day, imprisoned as I am by the coronavirus. Every time I glance at it, I am reminded that life is not as it should be. That mask fuels my anger about the way we, by which I mean our government, and this is Canadian, the outcomes are way worse than they should be. The evidence is in. Other governments with different species of capitalism are doing much better for their citizens. This makes me resentful, particularly as I am bombarded with inanities that are supposed to explain why there is nothing that can be done other than what is being done. This is nonsense on stilts. I'm sick and tired of those solemnly, portentously uttered banalities. I do not want to hear any of the following again. Quote, "We are following the science. We have to open up the economy. We're all in this together." Those soothing motherhood statements are meant to distort. They pervert the meaning of science, the nature of the economy, and the meaning of solidarity. They are used to legitimate unnecessary pain and suffering. Let me return to the Venetian mask and its curved beak and lovely decorations. It is a replica of the masks worn by healthcare workers and those of the population who could afford them during the plague that hit Venice and much of Europe during the 14th century. The Venetians knew nothing about germs or bacteria or viruses. They were not following what we call science. There was no science as we know it. They did, however, unlike us, use the knowledge they did have. Venetians saw that the infection spread in some invisible way. It simply made sense to them not to breathe the air that might carry whatever was infecting people. We in contemporary Canada know about the virus. We know how small it is. We know how it might be attracted to surfaces we touch. We know that it might be spread by breathing out. Yet we are still arguing as to whether we should wear masks, and if so, whether doing so is important enough to force others to wear them. We, of course, say we are following the science. If this allows doubts to be thrown on the utility of masks, stop following that science, please. Let us take our cue from the less scientific Venetians. Make everyone wear masks until the plague is beaten back. Science back then being much more primitive than it is today, the Venetians were not sure why they had been hit by the pestilence. But they figured out that since the disease had been unknown to them until it hit them, it must have traveled in from somewhere. So they did two things. They decided to stop it from traveling. And from those among them already afflicted to others in Venice. They moved the infected people to a small island to be treated. But this is also where health workers were first equipped with those masks. They also reasoned that the plague might have come to Venice by travelers. So they determined that any new boat that arrived should be kept away from its citizenry for a while, anchored at another nearby island. The period they chose was 40 days. Quarantina, they called it. 700 years have passed since Venice's isolation and quarantining were deployed as preventative measures. And that scientific know-how is still our basic approach. We have some protocols, such as asking people who've traveled to isolate themselves for a while. Yet with all our science, we are still pondering long and hard to determine when, and if so, for how long, people who might carry the virus should be kept away from others for how long. Those hesitations and our dithering on masks, these tepid measures, it should worry us. After all, we have new knowledge we could use. We have developed tests that could detect the presence of the virulent virus in people not yet obviously afflicted, enabling us to isolate them and locate all the people with whom they have been in contact with and are, therefore, in danger of becoming ill and further spreading the infection. Considering that this is a real advance on the way Venice and Europe were able to approach plagues, following the science should mean that we make intensive and systematic use of the tools. But as they follow the science, which our governments never tire of telling us to do, those same governments test and do contact tracing without conviction, haphazardly, and therefore with little success. For instance, it has been reported that in Toronto, our scientific authorities have no idea where 65% of transmitted cases come from. There remain many mystery carriers, an Australian term, out there, continuing to do unintentional harm. The Toronto Star's Josh Rubin reported that when the pandemic made a sudden comeback in October, the people who kept on telling us that they are and we should be following the science decided to cut down on the testing and contact tracing because the growth in cases made it all but impossible to keep up. The proof is in the pudding. In those countries where everyone wears the modern versions of the Venetian mask, where they quarantine seriously, and where they test and contact trace with rigor. China, Mongolia, Vietnam, Singapore, Taiwan, Kerala, Cuba, Australia, New Zealand, the pandemic has been halted in its tracks. Not so here. The Venetians' efforts were not all, that successful because they had limited technical and material resources, but their thinking abilities were no different than ours. This is why a question arises as to how much science is adding to our responses. Not only do we neglect the new knowledge and technology as we, continue to guess just as the Venetians did. How we decide that we are far enough away. We have come up with a measure of 6 feet or 2 meters or the length of a hockey stick. Is that based on science that the Venetians did not have? The 6-foot rule, it turns out, was the distance suggested during the Spanish flu epidemic at the end of World War I. Are we to believe that it was scientifically arrived at, and if so, that it is bound to work for a different epidemic? Of course, some of our scientific advantages are put to some good uses. The 14th century treatment of infected people was, by today's standards, primitive, sweating, bloodletting, and forced urinating and vomiting. We have hospitals, ways of bringing down temperatures, ventilators, and the like. We know how to do some things better. We know what equipment is needed. But we do not necessarily have sufficient access to care centers or to equipment. We are in this situation because no one saw a chance to make money out of having better infrastructure to be ready for a potential public health crisis. Still, there is some hope. We should be able to develop vaccines to immunize most of us against this particular virus. This is what modern science can do and will do. There is money in it. So no matter how degrading the impulse to profit is, vaccinations do denote a tremendous advance. But that does not deal with the issue of how we use science in the meanwhile. Much of what we should do, and do not do very well, ensuring the wearing of masks and forced isolation and physical distancing, is not the kind of organized knowledge only understood by a few gifted and skilled scientists. It's not rocket science. This is revealed when a hue and a cry goes up because some people gathered in a park or at a nightclub or went to a wedding. Come on, people, what is so hard? Use your common sense. Premier Ford tells us plaintively, he is right. It is common sense. So why does he not make us follow this simple science? Being that lax, it is inevitable that governments like his do not make the most of the scientific advances that have been made since 1350. Our modern technologies can furnish us with data about the extent and locales of infections, permitting more pointed measures to stop activities, recommend isolations, and the like. We can also measure whether the rates of infection are increasing or decreasing. That is, whether following the science is working. Mostly, it is not. As noted, we use our technological abilities, testing, and contact tracing very poorly when compared to the way it is used in other virus-beating jurisdictions. Our scientific findings to stop the spread of infections are used haphazardly and unevenly. Why don't governments follow the science they have at their disposal? The answer is that we don't care about science. Pure and simple. Follow the science is a slogan, not a principle. It can be ditched like any other mindless slogan, and it will be ditched when there is a desire to achieve a conflicting goal, one which conflicts with better health. Another goal brings me to another slogan. We have to open up the economy. What the devil is the economy? Recently, a court in India declared that the Ganges and Yamuna rivers were living entities, and it extended that holding to cover the glaciers that feed these rivers. Wow. New Zealand has enacted a law recognizing the Wanganui River as a living entity. Ecuador's constitution acknowledges nature's right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. Bolivia, it has a similar provision. It is the economy, Is the economy. Is it like a natural phenomenon? Is it a thing that exists in its own right, requiring the guardians to protect its life and dignity? Of course not. The economy is a creation of society. It is simply how we decide to produce goods and services we need and want for the good or ill, and really it is for the ill. We have chosen a variety of capitalism, often called market capitalism. At the center of its working, it expects every individual to compete with all others as they pursue their own selfish interests. It is a regime in which a few own most of the means of production in which they can invest for even more profit, while the others, those without any meaningful amount of disposable wealth, possessed only of their own capacities, do all the work. The argument for the maintenance and perpetuation of this regime is that the aggregated outcomes of the pursuit of self-interest by the owners of wealth, the capitalists, and by all the non-wealth owners in a competitive setting, those being the workers, will lead to the best outcome for society as a whole. If the rich are able to garner more wealth, we will all benefit. The lack of logic and the lack of evidence for this proposition were neatly pointed out by a clergyman who noted that the trickle-down theory might well be a good economic theory, but that it would always fail to work because of all those sponges at the top. The now widely acknowledged yawning gaps in both wealth and income between the sponges at the top, the 1 or the 0.1 percenters, and the rest of society are irrefutable evidence that the economy we privilege does not work as its proponents say it will. The exercise only works well for a select few, not for the whole of society. Yet the trickle-down theory is treated as a scientific truth. This is the science governments follow diligently, with fervor. They rely on capitalists to invest their wealth to generate social well-being. This gives capitalists enormous economic and political power, and they use it, or more accurately, abuse it. The logic of this science is that no one, especially no capitalist, is responsible for the welfare of any other person. There is no requirement that privately owned wealth should be used to meet the people's needs. The science of trickle-down will magically do the trick. What this signifies is that private, self-serving actors cannot be expected to deal with a public problem like a pandemic. They are, as dictated by science, rightly way too busy feathering their own nests. This is particularly true of capitalists who rule the roost in the variety of capitalism we enjoy in Canada. They attack workers' wages, they ceaselessly rail and push against regulatory systems that protect the environment, workers, consumers, and the most vulnerable among us.